And our first speaker is a professor from St. John's University from USA and a leading expert in the field of plagiarism prevention in academic work, Professor Miguel Roig. Miguel, you have the audience.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the kind introduction. I'd like to start by defining our terms. As we all know, plagiarism occurs when we take others' material and we present it as our own. Self-plagiarism is somewhat of a controversial term because it's not possible to steal from oneself, correct? We're not stealing anybody else's work. We are reusing our own work. But the trouble is that we're passing it off as new work. So again, self-plagiarism is defined as using our previously disseminated work as new content. And in the English language literature, several terms have been used to convey this problem. And at the bottom of the slide, you have some of them. It's not a complete list of the terms that is used, but for example, in academic settings, student with students, it's known as double dipping. In research and publications, then there are several terms that are used that actually describe different types of self-plagiarism, which we'll take a look in a little bit. The interest in self-plagiarism has been increasing in the past, within the past about 20 years. Prior to 2000, there was hardly any mention in the biomedical literature of the term self-plagiarism. Yes, it would sometimes be mentioned in papers on plagiarism, but this recent survey of the social science literature uncovered from 1968 until the present time, until 2017, a total of 133 papers dealing with the topic of self-plagiarism. The peak of interest in this topic appeared to be in the year 2013. And so just last on Monday, I carried out my own informal survey of the number of papers that have been published in, that have been identified through PubMed, the PubMed database, where the term plagiarism or self-plagiarism is mentioned in the abstract. And so as of a couple of days ago, there had been 1,920 papers with the topic of plagiarism mentioned in the abstract or title, and 88 papers on self-plagiarism. So although not as popular a topic as plagiarism itself, it is a large problem for the publishing community. And I hope to show you this in the next few slides. But first, let's talk about self-plagiarism in the classroom. And that should be self-plagiarism, not plagiarism. So the usual complaint by students is, it's my own work. Why can't I reuse it? And not just by students, by the way. Oftentimes in my presentations to professional audiences, I will hear the same complaint by professionals. It's my own writing. Why can't I reuse it? Well, in reality, nobody is preventing you from reusing work. The point is to be able to, reuse it, but to tell the reader that you're reusing it, right? In terms of student self-plagiarism, one of the most comprehensive studies, and there hasn't been that much research on this topic with college students, but one of the better papers reported that, and these are very interesting views of students, right? That over 63% reported that they did not view reusing their own previous content as cheating. Moreover, 87% indicated that because they had created the work, they could use it as they saw fit. That is, they could reuse it whenever they wanted. So the prevailing attitude of students is that it's my own work, I should be able to reuse it. Why not? Now, these authors, and I agree, concluded that it's the lack of instruction on this important subject that accounts for most of the misconduct, academic misconduct with respect to self-plagiarism, and also with plagiarism, by the way. Many students seem not to be very clear about what that entails, but we'll confine ourselves to the problem of reuse, self-plagiarism. So let me give you some sample policies of universities, mainly from the United States. Now, I did a survey of policies several years ago, and what I found is that not too many universities cover the topic of self-plagiarism, while most cover the topic of plagiarism. Very few cover self-plagiarism. When they do, they tend to focus on the reuse of assignments. So for example, a quote from this particular university, and it's a major university, the act of plagiarism can be committed deliberately, as in purchasing a research paper from a commercial source. So they're defining plagiarism. And then in red here, it can even be submitting a paper that you prepare for one class as fulfillment for an assignment in another class without receiving permission from your instructor. The latter is a form of self-plagiarism. So at least some universities do provide some modicum of instruction in their policies. So now these are usually, these are policies that are in university, what they call university catalogs. Each university publishes a book with all their policies, their course descriptions, and so on and so forth. Most students don't read everything in these course catalogs, so you have to wonder the extent to which they are familiar with these policies. So here's another one. Self-plagiarism, the use of an essay or report for one course to satisfy the requirements of another course. And it goes again, yeah, the student has to have permission from one instructor in order to reuse it in another course. Here's perhaps the more comprehensive one. Related to plagiarism is the notion of self-plagiarism, or using material. Now this is interesting. Now this policy is not just saying the whole assignment, but using material for one assignment for another assignment as well. This is also sometimes referred to as double dipping, or recycling assignments is another form of academic dishonesty. While this is sometimes permissible, especially if the student will be doing a larger project or greater work in order to fulfill more than one assignment, the permission of each affected instructor must be obtained. And frankly, this is perhaps the best policy that I have seen, the best articulated policy, that it not only double dipping, self-plagiarism of academic work doesn't just involve using an entire assignment, but perhaps portions of an assignment. So, but again, as I said, the problem is that policies in a handbook and a course catalog don't constitute instruction. That is, it seems that most instructors do not cover, while they may cover, they may warn students about plagiarism in their syllabi or in their instruction during class, they seldom, if ever, talk about self-plagiarism. So the question arises, what about reusing portions of a paper? How much are we as instructors willing to tolerate in terms of reuse? Are 3/4 of a previous assignment permissible? What about half of an assignment? What about a quarter of the assignment? I mean, we can start coming up with what should be the operational definition of self-plagiarism in the classroom. What are we willing to tolerate? Obviously, in my classes, I don't tolerate any. And I always, I'm very clear that, with exceptions, by the way, and I have made exceptions about this, but all work must be original and it must be new. This is very important. You don't want a student to get credit for something that they have already received credit for. And so I think as instructors, we have a responsibility to convey to our students that that their work is expected to be new. And we should actually tell them the rationale for this. That is that we expect it to be new because we don't expect them to get credit twice for the same thing. I think that's important. In that respect, I usually, in all my classes, I go over what has come to be known as the reader-writer contract. And it is this, and by the way, I use this in all my presentations and a lot of my papers. I talk about this because I think that when we ground the author in terms of this contract, you can forget about questions of originality and self-plagiarism and so on, because this contract that that we assume is taking place takes care of these issues. So what is the reader-writer contract? In most situations, and unless we indicate otherwise, readers of our work assume that the material that they are reading is accurate, original, that it's my own work, and when it comes to self-plagiarism, and that it's new. It has not been submitted or disseminated or published before. And by the way, notice that I make the distinction between published and disseminated. Just like plagiarism does not necessarily, it's not necessarily about published work. You can plagiarize unpublished work, right? So the same thing applies to self-plagiarism. The material is new. It has not been disseminated previously. So this is the grounding principle with which I approach these things in the classroom, in presentations, and so on, both about plagiarism and about self-plagiarism. So that's the classroom, and there's plenty of plenty of work that needs to be done to convey the message to our students. But also to our faculty as well, because it turns out that many faculty, many instructors have similar views about self-plagiarism. So let's take a look at self-plagiarism now as research misconduct, and you'll be surprised as to how we in the US and perhaps Western Europe treat this problem. So in the US, right, research misconduct occurs when there is fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. And that's the case for most countries in general, right? Self-plagiarism does not usually fall under the definition, under most definitions of research misconduct. We call it misconduct, and I think rightly so, and some forms of self-plagiarism may rise to the level of misconduct because, as I will try to show later, they could be thought of instances of fabrication. I'll try to show that in a minute. But generally speaking, self-plagiarism does not constitute research misconduct. Now, back in 1969, the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine published an editorial about duplicate publication in saying our journal will not publish things that have been published elsewhere. And that rule, which is known as the Ingelfinger rule, has been adopted by most journals, not just in biomedicine, but in most scholarly journals. Most scholarly journals want original material. They don't want papers that have been with exceptions. You know, there are exceptions. Translations being one exception. Things that papers that have that are important in terms of health implications and so on and so forth. Those might be exceptions, but generally speaking, if a finding has been published elsewhere, most papers don't want it. So now, there are several types of self-plagiarism. I'm going to list them all here, most of them anyway. So the most common one, in terms of the biomedical publishing, the primary literature in biomedical publishing and scholarship, right? It's duplicate publication, right? And sometimes it goes quadruplicate, quadruplicate. That is, you know, a paper is published once in a journal and then it's published again and again and again. I believe the record is 7 times. But I'm sorry, I don't have a reference to back it up. It's from memory that I've heard this. So it's where a paper, the entire paper, right? The entire paper is republished. There's also what's called redundant publication, and this can take several forms, depending on whether you use data or depending on many factors. But it's a publication that essentially either duplicates major portions of an already published paper, or its data, it's not adding anything. It is redundant. It doesn't say anything new, but it's the redundancy is typically used in the context of reuse of data or reuse of text. Okay, so with respect to data, and I'm right now I'm concentrating on data because these are the more self-plagiarism of data is perhaps the more dangerous form of self-plagiarism as far as potential health implications, you know, public health implications, right? So, for instance, you know, a common type of self-plagiarism in some disciplines is augmented publication, where a data set is published, and then later additional data points are added, and so the data set is published again. But what happens is that the author in the second publication does not make it clear that part of those data had already been published. That's a problem. The opposite of that is disaggregated data, where a data set is published, and then in a second publication, some of the data points are removed, and they are the data is reanalyzed again and published. Again, with little or no reference to the previous publication. That's very problematic. Then there is what's known as Salami Publication or piecemeal publication. There are several terms to describe it. Segmented publication, where a data set is published, or rather, excuse me, a data set is generated, and then little pieces, one piece is published here, another piece is published there, another piece is published here. In most of these cases, what gives it away is that there's text that it's sections, you know, introductions, methodologies, sections of methodology that are identical. That's what gives it away. Again, these are problematic in terms of the data itself. In most cases of segmented publication, portions of data are reused. For example, control groups are reused in the different segments that are published. So all of these are problematic. This is one retraction that occurred recently where the author published it 3 times. And at least one of those times the paper was identified and retracted. So why is this a problem? Well, mainly because, let me backtrack here a second. So the way these things are identified, as I said, is because text is recycled, is reused, right? Unfortunately, in many cases, it almost seems, in some cases anyway, not in many cases, but in some cases, it is as if authors are not aware of these rules of the Ingelfinger rule, that they're not aware that they cannot republish these data. Anyway, most journals, and this is the theme here, most journals are only interested in original submissions. A lot of authors don't seem to get that. Now, most journals will caution against duplicate publication and perhaps other forms of self-plagiarism. But oftentimes this guidance is not very clear. It may be, for example, many journals often only discuss the issue of duplicate publication and not of text recycling. Some journals will ask authors in their instructions to authors that if there are any papers that have been published in the past that have similar content, that they should submit them for the author, for the editor to make a decision as to whether this submission that may have duplicated content, it's worth publishing. I think that leaving that decision to the editor is problematic, especially if the reader if it's not made clear to the reader that some content has been reused. I think that's problematic in several ways. Some journals even stipulate that they will tolerate a certain degree of overlap, so up to a point. Some will say, well, if there's more than 50% overlap, then we reject. And it can be as high as 30%. I suppose that journals that publish reviews, for example, as opposed to original contributions, might have a higher tolerance of reuse. So now, why is self-plagiarism problematic? Well, mainly because it misleads the reader. Readers, again, it violates the reader-writer contract. I am assuming that what I'm reading is new, okay? But especially with respect to data, data should be considered sacred, so that when data are presented that have already been published, and the reader believes that the second data set is independent, different, a separate data from the first publication, that is very similar to fabricating data. That is, the second publication, the second data set that is being reused, and is really the same data set that is being reused, doesn't exist. Only this one exists. But if the author is conveying these data as being new, then you have data fabrication. So in instances in which data are conveyed and the reader identifies it as new, that's data that do not exist. And usually what happens is that you're distorting, the reason this is problematic is that you're distorting the scientific record. You are now enhancing, you may be enhancing the effect of a new pharmaceutical falsely. So this is very problematic. One of the problems with duplicate publication is the most obvious form of reuse, right? Of self-plagiarism. I mean, the entire article is being replicated, right? It turns out that this is from a recent study. Not all duplicates are tagged as being duplicates by the journals, so that some of the journals may not even be aware that they have a duplicate. And in some cases, I'm sorry to say, especially journals of lower caliber, and especially predatory journals or fake journals, they will leave it alone. They don't care. An interesting study now dating back over 20 years demonstrated how in a meta-analysis, a duplicate, what we call a covert duplicate, that is a duplicate data set, duplicate publication, say, actually can, misrepresent the efficacy of a health implementation. And so, no, this has some very dangerous public health implications. So anyway, so there's a lot more that we can say about covert self-plagiarism, especially as it involves with data, which is why, I always, another theme of mine is that when we write, and I really want to stress this, when we carry out original research, and there are times when we want to reuse data, right? I have reused my own data. Of course, I make it clear to the reader that I'm doing so. When I want to do, for example, a before and after comparison, data that had been collected earlier compared to new data, right? But what's important in science is that the provenance of data has to be clear to the reader. Yes, it has to be clear to the editor, right? So those policies that stress that, yes, the editor wants to see other papers. My point is that it has to be clear to the reader. The scientific record has to be clear in terms of the originality of data. So now, going back to all of those types of self-plagiarism, whether it's duplicate, salami, augmented, all of those are fine. They're acceptable as long as the reader is made aware that data are being reused. And that's it. It's very simple. Go ahead, reuse the data. But again, a lot of journals only want original data. And so this is where we get the problem, right? They want original data. Authors want their publications. And so you have a conflict there. And this is why these kinds of things occur. So now let's talk about text recycling. And that's become a issue of contention in recent years. What about text recycling? Well, so it happens, right? In several studies, including one of mine several years ago, has found that yes, people do reuse their own text, right? Some folks more than others. And so several studies have been finding pretty much the same thing. Some disciplines, it seems, self-plagiarism of text or text recycling seems to be more common in some disciplines than others, but most individuals most researchers seem to engage in a certain limited amount of recycling. Now, the question arises, when should we allow, if text recycling should be allowed, under what conditions, what sections of the paper should it be allowed. And usually, by the way, the reason why this question arises is because of a particular problem that occurs in disciplines where the language is very complex. The descriptions of concepts are very intricate, right? That is, this is a very common expression. There are so many ways in which you can convey the same idea, especially when you're dealing with very technical terms, for which there are no synonyms, there's no way to change them, right? So the question is, are some papers more, is it more acceptable to have recycling in some papers rather than others? Well, and again, we can ask the questions, where should we allow recycling? We'll go over a little bit about some of the policies of some of the journals, right? So here's some guidance on self-plagiarism, and it's, as I said, it's not uniform, okay? So some journals, I made that point earlier, allow between 10% to 30%. Christensen is the American Medical Association Manual of Style. It's one of the most widely writing styles that used in biomedicine, in English language. And so 10%, whereas others say, no, as much as 30%, right? And similarly, informal polls have found that this is more or less how much we're willing to accept. And so here's some guidance from journals, right? Yes, please tell the editor how much you are reusing. So there are some journals that request that the editor be told how much reuse is taking place. Other journals say, well, no, it's not allowed. We don't allow any type of text reuse. None, nothing. Everything has to be new. Everything has to be original. Others say, well, we'll allow you to reuse entire method sections. You can reuse the method section and you're okay. They tell you, look, don't abuse it, but anesthesia and analgesia explicitly accepts self-plagiarism in the method section of a manuscript. It could be the entire methods. It's interesting how it can differ across journals. So in other journals, we'll even allow reuse in methodologies and literature reviews, something that I personally would discourage. I would not encourage anyone to reuse literature reviews or to reuse text from literature reviews. But this is the American Diabetes Association journals. So the guidance is very variable. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why it can be dangerous, even when it's used in method sections, in that you copy paste a method section, but you forget that you made a change in your methodology, but you simply copy paste it. And so you miss out, you are misleading readers in perhaps what's probably the most important section of the paper, which is the method section. It's the section that allows anyone to replicate the work, right? Yeah, so again, there are many different types of guidance. COPE has guidance, and by the way, so what has occurred within the past, say 10 years or so, is some flexibility in the guidance on text recycling, right? So the Committee on Publication Ethics, which has become the ethics clearinghouse for editors of scholarly journals, says, yes, you can, there's some descriptions, it may be unavoidable sometimes to reuse text. And so please be discreet about it. Very, very flexible. Makes a lot of sense what they have to say. The American Psychological Association similarly provides some reasonable guidance. They do clarify, yes, you don't present your own work, your own previously published work as your own. That really applies to duplicate publication. But then they go, and I'm not going to read this for lack of time, that yes, sometimes it's permissible to reuse even without using quotation marks. And this is the part that I like to emphasize. Opening, and it's referring to recycled text, opening such paragraphs with a phrase like, as I have previously discussed, then you're telling the reader that I'm reusing this material. And so you give the citation of where exactly you had previously discussed X, Y, or Z. I think that this is a very, it's flexible and it makes a lot of sense to have that type of flexibility. That said, a previous prior president of the American Psychological Association has had papers retracted because of extensive reuse of text from other papers. Yeah. The problem with reusing text is that we are evolving into to have the technology to detect reuse, and not just copy pasting, but reuse that is much more subtle. So I envision the day when there will be services, programs that will very carefully determine the extent to which a new text, it's really derived from old text, which will speak to the degree of originality of subsequent work by the same author. So I think authors need to be careful about this, not because of the technology that we have today, but of the technology that we will have in the future. I want to end, my time is coming up, but several retractions on text recycling. There have been several of these. Question arises, what about conference presentations? This is something that has not been addressed by the literature. And there are different types of presentations. Well, when is text recycling okay in these presentations? As I said, there's not much guidance on these issues. Okay, I'm going to hurry up because I'm running out of time here. If you'll excuse me. One problem with publishing an article based on a conference is that if it is published in Proceedings, then that becomes a publication. Especially if from the Proceedings it is possible to determine if it is possible to replicate the study. So that's something that needs to be taken into account. If a Proceedings is published, Proceedings can be just the abstract or a condensed version of the abstract, but some Proceedings are the entire paper. If a Proceedings of a conference publishes the entire paper, that's a publication. Anyway, so there are lots of considerations about these matters. Forgive me, I'm going to skip several sections here. Let me just, again, lots of questions about what other situations should we be allowed to reuse text? And so in my slides, I have questions. Usually I don't provide the answers, but these are things that we ought to be thinking about because there's no guidance on these matters. Lastly, why is self-plagiarism so prevalent? It's because of the need, the publish or perish climate. we need publications, and reusing our previously disseminated content, it's a good way to increase those numbers of publications. There's also poor attitudes about scholarship. That is that it's okay to reuse. In other words, many authors are not mindful of that reader-writer contract. And there's the issue of issues with language proficiency. I mean, people are more likely to reuse if the author has difficulties with the language. If they have difficulties writing in the language in which they're publishing. And there's intellectual laziness. Some folks don't like to write, so they reuse. So avoid reusing, and always be mindful. This is what I convey to my audiences, when they're mainly authors. Be mindful of the reader-writer contract. Remember that the reader is assuming that what you're writing is accurate, that it's original, that you wrote it, and you haven't disseminated it. And if you did, tell the reader. And so, thank you. And this is from Google Translate. So thank you. I'll take your questions now or later. You can email them to me if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. It was really interesting. And as I said in the beginning, it's quite a new topic for a Russian audience. But let me ask you the first question. How often do you really meet with self-plagiarism in your own work?
Well, I mean, so because my work has been featured in the United States Office of Research Integrity, I often get questions from authors and editors about, is this acceptable? Is this type of reuse acceptable? So it's difficult to answer that question, but I can tell you that it's within the past few years, whereas early on, I've been working in this field for over 20 years, and whereas in the 1990s, the questions were about plagiarism, in recent years, the questions have been about self-plagiarism, and essentially, issues of, can I reuse from, for example, from a blog? Is it okay for me to take content from a blog and publish it in an article? And so it's an interesting question, and it really depends on it depends on several factors. But quite often, the questions that I get from readers of my work are on this problem. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And here's another question from our participants. What do you think, also from your practice, about self-plagiarism between different types of academic work? You partly answered it talking about blogs, but if, for example, we are talking about student work, which is then published as an article.
Yeah, so for example, this is one of the slides that I fast-tracked and I didn't really spend much time on it, but it is common practice for a thesis to later be published as an article or even a book. And this is perfectly acceptable. No one questioned that type of reuse. But increasingly, or at least in some universities, first demand that the student, for example, publish articles, and then those can be reused in a thesis. Right? So it's backwards of what we normally do, right? And that's okay also. I mean, it really depends on the stipulations of the university. But I once worked on a case in which the articles that were used in a thesis had been co-authored. And so the question arises, how much does the author of the thesis, or rather, how much input did the author of the thesis have in those published articles that were later used as part of the thesis? So to answer your question, yes, it's perfectly fine to take academic work that is disseminated within a university, a term paper, a thesis, even a conference presentation, and to publish that. That's perfectly acceptable. What I think that the trend is for authors to be transparent and identify any prior dissemination. That is, talk about where this paper comes from.
I see. As many of our participants are Russian speakers and they write in Russian, here's another question. Do you know any examples of cross-language self-plagiarism, especially when the author's first language is not English?
Yes, so some retractions have been there have been some retractions of work that have been translated papers that have been published in a different language, right? You know, some journals will accept this. So the common practice is that it is acceptable for an author to translate a paper in one of his or her papers and publish it in another journal. That's an acceptable practice as long as the editors of the journals are appraised of this second publication. So how often does it happen? That's an interesting question. We don't know. And the reason we don't know is that there's no software. I mean, there's no way of picking up translated work there's no software. There's no, actually, there is some software available, but it's only in the beginning stages. There's no technology that allows one to pick up the translated work as having been previously published.
Well, we have some developments, technological developments about this in our system, but that's going to be tomorrow, in tomorrow's sections. And the last question which we wanted to ask you today is, it seems like the approach to detecting and what to do with self-plagiarism is very different in different institutions and in different countries. And what do you think, how this can be done more common, and how should we address this problem institutionally, not just from the point of view of authors, but also what should governments do, the universities do?
Yeah, this is an incredibly complex question because for the following reasons. One is that both plagiarism and self-plagiarism come in many forms. And so, and then there's the issue of intentionality. In other words, there are many factors that come into play. So that's one problem. But another problem is that in the U.S. and in several other nations, there are procedures in place. In the United States, for example, all institutions that receive federal money, and that's most institutions, must have a research integrity policy, and that policy has to specify how they deal with those who violate the rules. And so the policies for how to deal with the ones who violate the rules, who plagiarize, self-plagiarize, and so on and so forth, can differ. And it's usually a committee that investigates the case and comes up with with their findings. And the punishment can either be the person is dismissed from work, or the individual is subjected to training. So it really depends on many, many factors. That's an area that really needs a lot of work, especially because I just told you about the United States, but different countries have different procedures for handling cases of misconduct. And this is really problematic. In many countries, institutions don't do anything. In some countries, there's not even a government agency that regulates this kind of problem. So we have a lot of work to do in that area.
Yeah, that's right. That's kind of a common problem between all the countries. Okay, we thank you very much.